What is striking about the Maya collapse and the 5 other lost civilizations in your script is that history rarely ends with a sudden bang. Instead, it unravels through a slow, crushing feedback loop of ecological stress, political rigidity, and broken social contracts. To help bring your video's narrative together, here is a clear breakdown of the structural pattern behind these famous collapses, along with a look at how the remaining 5 civilizations fit the exact same trend. The pattern of disappearance across all 6 civilizations. The illusion of a sudden disappearance is usually caused by modern observers confusing the collapse of a ruling state with the extinction of a people. The breakdown almost always follows 3 distinct phases: leverage, high population density, rigid trade infrastructure, ramifications, and heavy resource demands set a fragile baseline. Drought, deforestation, or climate shifts destabilize the agricultural water supply. Institutional crisis. Rulers lose divine political legitimacy as they fail to solve the crisis. People vote with their feet. How the remaining 5 civilizations fit the blueprint. Civilization, what built them, the trigger, stressors, what actually happened, Indus Valley, Harappan, standardized grid cities, vast trade, public sanitation, peaceful civic order, shifting monsoon patterns, and drying riverbeds like the Sarasvati River. Cities didn't burn. People simply abandoned urban centers and migrated east toward the Ganges to farm in smaller groups. Ancestral Puebloans, Chaco Canyon, multi-story stone architecture, complex regional road networks, trade hubs. A multi-decade mega-drought in the 12th, 13th centuries combined with resource depletion. They abandoned their massive great houses and dispersed south and east, establishing modern Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblo communities. Cahokia massive earthen mounds. Dense urban population near modern St. Louis, corn surplus, deforestation, soil degradation, local flooding, and shifting political alliances. The complex chiefdom fractured. The city emptied as people moved back to decentralized river villages across the American Midwest. Rapa Nui, Easter Island. Extraordinary megalithic engineering, Moai. Tight-knit clan networks. Severe deforestation, loss of palm trees, invasive species, rats, and later European contact/disease. The statue-building culture collapsed under resource scarcity and internal warfare. But the Rapa Nui people survived on the island. Norse Greenland, 500 years of European-style pastoral farming, ivory export networks, stone churches. The onset of the Little Ice Age, trade isolation from Europe, and refusal to adapt Inuit hunting techniques. As farming failed and sea ice cut off Norwegian trade ships, the settlements slowly starved out or were abandoned as survivors returned to Europe. Key takeaways for your narrative. Failure of systemic resilience. None of these societies were destroyed by a single disaster. They failed because their institutions became too rigid to adapt when multiple stressors, drought plus war plus trade disruption, hit simultaneously. Rulers versus reality. In almost every case, political leadership continued demanding resources, labor, or prestige projects right up until the system broke. The human continuation. People rarely vanish. They scatter, adapt, drop their old titles, and build something simpler somewhere else. The collapse of the Ancestral Puebloan centers highlights the exact same human truth as the Maya and the Indus Valley before them. A ruin is not a tomb, and an empty building is not a vanished people. When the great houses of Chaco Canyon and the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde fell silent at the end of the 13th century, it wasn't because an entire population vanished into thin air. It was because the elaborate social and political contract of the Southwest simply ran out of options. The Southwestern Cascade, Chaco, and Mesa Verde. Monumental masonry, wide trade networks, high ritual authority at their peak, and dense populations tied to canyon and mesa farming. The Great Drought. Late 13th century multi-decade mega-drought collapses crop yields. Deforestation and soil erosion worsen the crisis. Institutional crack. Ritual leadership loses credibility. Resource competition triggers localized violence and social instability. Reorganization. Communities abandon the stone cities and migrate south and east, migration, to re-establish as modern Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblos. The myth of the vanished race. For decades, 19th century antiquarians and early travelers looked at the magnificent masonry of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde and spun tales of a lost civilization that mysteriously evaporated. This framing was not just bad history, it actively erased the living descendants. Modern Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblo communities have always maintained explicit oral histories tracking these exact migrations. To the ancestors who lived through it, leaving Mesa Verde was not an apocalyptic end. It was a deliberate, necessary decision to abandon an environment and political system that no longer sustained life. What the pattern teaches us. Looking across all three civilizations covered so far, the Maya abandoned their divine kings and southern lowland cities when drought and warfare broke the agricultural system, migrating and reorganizing into northern kingdoms. The Indus Valley abandoned their standardized, highly planned brick metropolises when shifting monsoon patterns dried up crucial rivers, dispersing eastward into smaller agricultural villages. The Ancestral Puebloans left their cliff dwellings and great houses when prolonged drought shattered regional stability, walking south and east to build new, resilient communities. In every single case, modern culture looks at empty stone walls and calls it a disappearance. But to the people who walked away, it was simply survival over loyalty to a broken system. They invented elaborate theories about lost tribes, ancient Europeans, or mysterious mound builders. Anything to avoid recognizing that Native Americans had constructed major cities right where modern farmland and highways now stood. That refusal served a purpose. It made it easier to claim land by imagining an empty continent rather than an occupied continent with a deep history of urban building. The fifth civilization takes us to one of the most isolated places on Earth. Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island, sits in the Pacific Ocean thousands of miles from any continent. Polynesians arrived around the 12th century, bringing crops, chickens, and incredible maritime skills. Over the following centuries, they built a complex society famous for carving and moving hundreds of massive stone statues called moai. For a long time, Rapa Nui was held up as the ultimate parable of ecological suicide. The idea that people recklessly cut down every tree to move statues, leading to total famine and collapse. But modern research tells a far more subtle story. The environment was indeed altered. Forests were cleared for agriculture, and rats brought by early canoes ate palm seeds, preventing the trees from growing back. Yet the islanders did not simply give up and perish. They adapted. They built rock gardens to conserve moisture and protect crops from wind, showing remarkable agricultural ingenuity. The catastrophic drop in population came later, driven largely by European contact in the 18th and 19th centuries, which brought catastrophic diseases and brutal slave raids. The traditional social structure broke down, and the statue-building era ended. But the Rapa Nui people survived. Their language, culture, and descendants remain on the island today. The sixth civilization brings us to the icy edge of the North Atlantic. In the late 10th century, Norse settlers established communities in Greenland. For nearly 500 years, they farmed, built stone churches, and exported walrus ivory to Europe. Then, during the 15th century, the Norse settlements vanished. As the Little Ice Age lowered global temperatures, sea ice made trade routes to Europe dangerous and unpredictable. European demand for walrus ivory dropped as elephant ivory became more accessible. The settlers struggled to maintain a traditional Scandinavian farming lifestyle in an increasingly Arctic climate. Unlike the local Inuit, who possessed deeply adapted hunting and maritime techniques, the Norse held tightly to an agricultural system that no longer fit the land. When the trade failed and the climate hardened, the settlements were gradually abandoned, their inhabitants starving, dying out, or sailing back to Europe. When you step back and look at all six of these civilizations, the pattern becomes inescapable. Cities fell, monuments were left to the elements, and grand political institutions crumbled under the combined weight of climate shifts, trade failures, and social strain. Yet, in almost every case, human beings endured. They packed up what they could carry, abandoned broken systems, and moved towards safer ground. History is not a graveyard of vanished species. It is a long, winding story of human adaptation. The real lesson of these six civilizations is not that we are immune to collapse, but that no architecture, authority, or technology can protect a society if it loses the flexibility to change when its environment demands it. At the same time, economic connections shifted. Demand for Greenlandic walrus ivory declined as elephant ivory became more available in European markets. Conflicts between European powers also complicated Atlantic shipping. As trade links weakened, the settlements became more isolated, making it harder to obtain timber, iron, and other essential goods. Relationships with the Inuit, who had expanded into Greenland from the north during the same centuries, were complex. The Norse did not adopt Inuit technologies like kayaks or flexible skin boats that made ice hunting highly effective. Instead, they maintained a European livestock-focused strategy that became increasingly expensive as conditions hardened. Faced with declining trade, shrinking pastures, and rising seas, people likely made the decision, individually or in small groups, to pack up, board ships, and return to Iceland or Scandinavia. The Norse didn't vanish into thin air. They simply walked, or sailed, away from an economic investment that no longer made sense. When you step back and look at all 6 of these civilizations, the Maya, the Indus, the Ancestral Puebloans, Cahokia, Rapa Nui, and Norse Greenland, a quiet, undeniable pattern emerges. We love the myth of the lost civilization because it sounds ghostly, dramatic, and supernatural. It lets us imagine a world where entire empires are swept away in a single catastrophic afternoon. But the reality is far more grounding and far more relevant to our modern lives. Civilizations do not vanish like a magician's assistant. What actually collapses is the system, the delicate web of trade agreements, political promises, divine mandates, and resource management that keeps millions of strangers cooperating toward a shared goal. When the climate shifts, when trade routes dry up, or when the leaders at the top can no longer deliver on basic security and stability, people adapt. They abandon grand monuments, step out of rigid social hierarchies, pack up what they can carry, and seek better lives elsewhere. History is not a graveyard of vanished species. It is an ongoing story of human adaptation. The true lesson of these 6 lost worlds is not that we are doomed to disappear, but that no amount of grand architecture, advanced technology, or military power can save a society if it loses the flexibility to change when its environment demands it. Norse Greenland was not a tragedy, but a calculated departure. The real failure wasn't a lack of adaptation. It was an eroded economic purpose that made staying no longer worth the risk. For nearly 5 centuries, these communities had thrived as the Arctic branch of a European luxury economy. The walrus ivory they harvested, a material in high demand for intricate medieval carvings, provided the financial lifeblood of the colonies. This export connected Greenland to vast trade networks, allowing for the reliable import of necessities like timber, which doesn't grow on the island, and iron, which was notoriously difficult to forge from local bog deposits. But in the 15th century, the global system changed. European markets were shifting away from ivory altogether, and elephant ivory, which was becoming more accessible through new African trade routes, began to reduce the value of walrus tusks. The Norse in Greenland suddenly found themselves in a marginal territory where their primary source of wealth had evaporated. Trade ships, now carrying significantly less profit, visited less often, and when they did, the prices for essential goods were prohibitively high. At the same time, the climate was cooling as the planet transitioned into the Little Ice Age. While the Norse did not starve from a stubborn refusal to eat local food, adaptation only goes so far for a small, isolated community. They increasingly relied on seals, but the livestock that had been central to their Scandinavian identity was struggling. When supply ships failed to arrive and the export supporting your existence no longer makes financial sense, staying becomes an act of collective refusal, not survival. Some colonists undoubtedly died during hard years, but it is far more likely that the majority of the population simply left when the opportunity arose. They were not defeated by the cold, they were defeated by changing global economics. Norse Greenland became isolated because it was no longer integrated into the system that had sustained it, and eventually, the last residents made the pragmatic decision to pack up their lives and return to Scandinavia or Iceland. Step back and look at all 6 lost civilizations: the southern Maya city-states, the Indus Valley, the Ancestral Puebloans, Cahokia, Rapa Nui, and Norse Greenland. A simple, undeniable pattern emerges. Civilizations are not species. They do not go extinct. The real mystery isn't where everyone went. It's why the system, the intricate social and economic contract that kept strangers cooperating toward a shared goal, stopped functioning. When the climate shifts, when trade routes dry up, or when the leaders at the top can no longer deliver on their promises, people adapt. They abandon grand monuments, walk out of rigid social hierarchies, pack up what they can carry, and seek better lives elsewhere. Collapse is not an apocalyptic event. It is what those collective decisions look like from far away. We love the myth of the ghostly, vanished empire because it is dramatic and lets us imagine our own world is somehow immune. But the truth is more grounded. History is not a graveyard of lost species. It is an ongoing story of human adaptation. The true lesson hidden within these 6 sets of ruins is that no amount of advanced architecture or centralized authority can protect a society if it loses the flexibility to change when its environment demands it. And that is the real secret of human survival. When the reasons to remain disappear, people do not evaporate into the ether. They carry their languages, their skills, their stories, and their resilience somewhere else, building new lives on the foundations of the old. If looking back at the real, unvarnished history of our ancestors makes you see our modern world in a different light, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week, we dig into the hidden truths of human history, the survival instincts we still carry, and the quiet lessons left behind in the ruins of the past. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.